the many things Alex does, including Zorian has an award-winning promoting equity, tolerance, reconciliation, and awareness through genocide education program, which they brought to Arizona classrooms 2 years in a row. And Alex and Sophie led the charge with that this year, and it's really a fantastic program, and we're really grateful for you bringing it here to our classroom. So I will turn it over to Sophie Waldron to continue with the introductions here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all those kind words. And I do highly encourage anyone who's interested in genocide and human rights to look into the Genocide and Human Rights University program. It's hosted up at the University of Toronto, and everyone loves studying genocide in the summer. So come and have a fun 2 weeks looking at genocide. So yes, so that's a great point. You can get university credit for attending the program. So you can make it count towards your degree. So another reason to come up and study with us. So hello and welcome to today's second panel with the Zorian Institute, the Erasure and Revitalization of Indigenous Cultures and Languages, a Comparative Analysis. So you may have heard my spiel before, but my name is Sophie Waldron, and I am the Deputy Manager for the Zorian Institute. And once again, I would like to take a moment to thank ASU and all of the organizers who have worked so tirelessly to make this panel and all of Genocide Awareness a Week happen. So there's too many to name, but we have like Volker Bennett, Timothy right here, Alex, we have Becky. So love to give them a quick round of applause for all their hard work. So for those of you who were not just in the previous panel, let me quickly introduce you to the Zorian Institute. So it's a registered not-for-profit charity with offices in Arlington, Massachusetts, Toronto, Canada, and Yerevan, Armenia. And it serves the cause of scholarship and public awareness relating to issues of genocide, human rights, and diaspora homeland relations. And this is done through a systematic, continued research of scholars and specialists using a comparative and multidisciplinary approach through research in accordance with the highest academic standards, education, and publications. So today's panel, the Erasure and Revitalization of Indigenous Cultures and Languages, is a comparative analysis that brings together a diverse group of scholars who offer perspectives from Indigenous communities in Canada, the United States, Western Armenia, and the Republic of Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh. And I'm pleased to introduce today's panelists, Dr. Lorena Fontaine, co-director of the Indigenous Languages Program and Associate Professor in Human Rights at the University of Winnipeg, Dr. Tala Chahinian, a faculty member in the program for Armenian Studies at UC Irvine, and joining us virtually, Dr. Lori Khatchadourian, an archaeologist and professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Cornell University. And the moderator for today's panel will be Dr. Henry Theriault, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University. So in 2006, the Institute established a peer-reviewed academic journal titled Genocide Studies International. Its objective was to create an understanding and awareness of genocide as an ongoing issue and promote the necessity of preventing it for pragmatic and moral reasons. The journal seeks to educate, inform, and encourage a new generation of scholars to conduct research on genocide and provide a forum for those who wish to work to prevent it. This interdisciplinary publication stresses that genocide is a universal human experience. To that end, it publishes scholarly articles and reviews on all aspects of genocide on a comparative and analytical basis. We strongly believe that research, analysis, and education and awareness are necessary to help civil societies, government, and policymakers to understand the consequences of the failure to prevent genocide. The forthcoming issue of 16.2 will explore Indigenous language erasure and revitalization, featuring work from today's panelists. So before I hand it over to Dr. Theriault, I just wanted to let you know that we are celebrating the participation of the Zorian Institute at Genocide Awareness Week by offering a special pre-order promotion for this forthcoming issue for a sale price of just $25, which is reduced down from the normal price of $80. So you can purchase that and other academic works by the Institute on our website. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Henry. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There we go. Get to the handoff. I'm going to be super brief because we want to hear from these folks, but I just want to say how important I think it's been for Genocide Awareness Week to have such a focus on cultural production, and the dangers of erasure, but also the efforts by Indigenous groups and others to reconstitute and in a very vital way produce their culture and to have it develop continually. I think it's a sign of incredible health, and it is probably one of the most significant ways of struggling against genocide there is. For those who have not yet been able to see the work that's on display at Arizona State, Esther Elia and then Clarence Cruz's amazing work is on display, and I can't remember the gallery name, and I will get lost if I try to describe how to get there, but you have to see it. This is stunning work, and it really shows how important cultural production is to the very basic identity of groups that especially are under assault, and how much that gives when you see the reactions of people who have looked at this, how important this production is at a very deep level for their sense of being and their sense of resistance to destruction. So I really want to congratulate you, and I want to congratulate our panelists ahead of time for the work that they've been doing sort of at both ends of this, working against destruction, but also working towards revitalization. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over, and we're going to go with Lori, who is coming in. I'm hoping sound and everything's going to work. Lori Khatchadourian. And we're not reading any bios or anything, but you can really check out these amazing stories of each of the panelists in the material that you've been provided for Genocide Awareness Week. So Lori, I hope you're okay to go. And if you are, we're going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm not able to turn on my video. When I select that, I'm told that the host has stopped the video, which is fine as long as I can share my presentation, but I don't know if that can be addressed. Can folks hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, let's see if I can. Yeah, I can't share my screen either. So it seems like we need some tech support on the other end so that we can get started.
I grew up feeling that that was normal. And then when I realized what had happened in the schools and started hearing other residential school survivors' experiences, I realized that my parents were trying to shelter me from being harmed. At the same time, it is learning about my cultural identity and learning my language that has created healing in my family and my community. So I understand the critical work that needs to be done to revitalize Indigenous languages and cultures, not only in Canada, but also the US, because that is where our healing lies, is to have an understanding of who we are. Some of my academic work, as well as my my advocacy work, revolves around ensuring that there are immersion programs for Indigenous children where they have access not only to learn their language, but understand who they are as Indigenous peoples in their community, and that relationship that is so integral to our territories. So one of the scholars that I work with in this advocacy work is Andrea Barron-Nicholas. We are part of an ad hoc team of lawyers and academics that do work on the issue of linguicide in Canada. And what we not only talk about in our research, but also in presentations, is to create an understanding that not educating Indigenous children in their native language can limit their development There's been research done in Canada that shows that it increases poverty and causes psychological issues. And that is why you can see in our the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples in prison. There are over 30,000 Indigenous children in the child welfare system. So what we're seeing is sort of an extension from one system into another, from education into our correction justice system, and also in our child welfare system. So the policies that resulted in the development of the residential schools no longer exist, but the killing of our languages in the educational system continues because children do not have access to their ancestral language in school and have to learn English and French at the expense, or French at the expense of their language, so of their own ancestral language. So I feel that this work is really important, not only in getting government to act, but also for our communities to realize the importance in revitalizing our language and culture. I think I'll stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That really was tremendous. And our last but by no means least speaker is Professor Shahinian. And please take it away.
All right. I'll wait.
We're hoping no more technical difficulty. What's going to happen? Keep up in that cross.
All right. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really grateful to the Zorian Institute for creating this opportunity for us to have a comparative discussion about, one, the erasure of cultural heritage, but also in what I'm going to speak about, the afterlife or the afterlives of cultural heritage following an experience of violence, rupture, and forced displacement. And I really want us to think a little bit about the life that I'm using in turning our attention to Western Armenian. It's particularly apt when we think about language, which as a form of expression, as part of the system of meaning making, is really something that we think about as a living, organic, evolving, changing, breathing thing. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about my research, which just came out in the form of a book last year, and tell you the story of Western Armenian after the 1915 genocide over the course of the 20th century, and just give you a glimpse of it. So tracing it in the period after empires, in the era of nation states, and in the shadow of statehood and nation states. When we think about cultural heritage of Western Armenia, post-genocide cultural heritage, particularly in terms of language, we often are talking about Western Armenian. But by way of really quick context, historical or linguistic background, I'd like to just kind of situate what we're talking about in terms of the distinction, the important distinction that exists between literary languages and regional dialects. So when we mention broadly Western Armenian, what we're referring to is the literary standard that underwent a process of modernization and standardization over the course of the 19th century. And in the case of Armenian, this modernization process basically branched out the language from its classical written iteration to two literary standards, and these processes took place congruently at the same time across empires, in the Russian Empire for the standard Eastern Armenian, and in the Ottoman Empire for the standard Western Armenian. And in both cases, what emerged was the development of literary languages that tried to bring the gap between the regional dialects and the classical or the written form sort of closer together, but inevitably they were each modeled over around specific dialects. And in the case of Eastern Armenian, it was fashioned around the Araratian Valley dialect, whereas in the case of Western Armenian, fashioned around the Constantinople-Istanbul variant or the dialect. And linguists sort of classify these two groups and in their mapping roughly divide up the divisions aside from linguistic sort of features like the locative case in Eastern or the g particle in Western, but it's really sort of a border line that divides them up. And this visual is significant in our case when we're thinking about how a language survives in displacement or in exile. What we see in the orange, red, brown, orange, yellow, brown area are the groupings of Western Armenian dialects, which are the ones that were particularly affected through the deportation and genocide and survived elsewhere outside of the territory that and land that they were spoken on and developed on. And as we can see, that also makes up the majority of the speakers at the time prior to the 1915 break, something that is very sort of very much reversed in the current dynamic if we consider the Armenian world and Armenian speakers today. I won't get there just yet. I'd like to, in guiding us with this flow of the survival of the language and as it moved, I think one of the first things I'd like to mention is that the majority of these dialects are no longer spoken. So in terms of regional dialects over the course of the 20th century, they have died out. And as I'm going to kind of suggest, they've also been sort of constructed and reconstructed otherwise and standardized into the literary standard Western Armenian. And so I'd like to begin by an anecdote and a quotation and to set up the conceptual understanding of where we are today with Western Armenian. The first will take us to Paris, one of the areas I study in the immediate aftermath of World War I, the genocide, where a group of surviving writers, as well as, or by majority, what critics call or refer to as orphaned writers, congregate and start producing literature in newspapers, in journals, in serial form, and eventually in bound books. And I'm going to share with you in an interview, one of these orphan generation writers, Zare Vorpuni, has remarked, recalled in remembrance, walking through the gardens of Luxembourg with a fellow writer, Shahan Shahnur, of the same generation. And they both are lamenting the lack of readership, the lack of constituted readership, and the lack of appreciation for the arts, the lack of funding, and yet they sort of work by day, but produce in this language, in their native tongue, all the time. And they say what we should do here is bring all of the Armenian books that we've been publishing in the last decade in exile and just pile them up, set them to fire, and then put a plaque there that says, "Here lies a literature that had no people." Now I'm going to switch and share with you another quote by a Beirut-born French-Armenian writer, Krikor Beledian, who wrote a piece for the occasion of the centennial of the genocide in 2015 called "In the Language of Catastrophe," where he says, "The scholar bears only the shadowy language. What can he do? Destroy his pen and remain silent? Move to another language to give testimony in that language? A second language? Is it not key to establish to the world that once we were not and now we are? This is a question of choice. A scholar can write in whichever language he chooses, as long as he truly has options. I choose to write in the language that genocidal will sought to erase. And the case in the case of Cree Corbeledian, he writes in Western Armenian in the standard, but also part of his novel series attempts to resurrect the lost regional dialects that he heard growing up in Beirut, spoken by his parent community. So here we have this idea of a language that both Cree Corbeledian and the other two examples that I gave present to us of a language that is being produced and reproduced in its literary standard by a critical mass of writers or intellectuals, but is unpeopled. On the other side, I want to also share from our current perspective the 2010 designation of Western Armenian by UNESCO's World Atlas of Languages as definitely endangered, which falls sort of a little above midway in their 6-point scale, and it basically hints to the idea that children no longer, and I'm quoting from their literature, children no longer learn the language as a mother tongue in the home. Of course, this is the focus here is on the spoken, how the language is transmitted in its spoken iteration. But by the time we arrive at 2010, there's a little bit of a conflation between the literary language and the dialects, because the dialects have already died off. And what is spoken and transmitted in its limited number is, in fact, the standard, which remains. In my book, which is titled Stateless: The Politics of the Armenian Language in Exile, I interrogate the framing of Western Armenian as an unpeopled language on the one hand, and as a dying language on the other, and examine the inherent tension they hold between the literary standard and the spoken tongue as an antidote to understanding language through the paradigm of loss, and rather approach it through the paradigm of diasporic power, what Khatchadourian has called stateless power, which gives name to the title and the framing that I use, stateless language. His scholarship over the last several decades has contributed to centralizing the diaspora experience so that it's not simply seen as a subsidiary to ideas of homeland host state. In asking us to imagine diaspora as an alternative to the nation state, he calls our attention to diasporic communities' potential to be sedentary and have built-in forms of governance that could engender emancipatory possibilities, as well as place restrictive demands on its members. It's precisely this dance between the flexible and generative versus the prohibitive aspects of diasporic governance that I'm interested in when thinking about language vitality and Western Armenian. The vantage point of the language's current endangered designation, in fact, gives us an opportunity to dismantle the neat, unequivocal relationship we assume with the Western Armenian standard and genocide survivors, and to probe how Western Armenian, in its Istanbul variant, became the language of the surviving dispersed population, who, as scholars like Vahe Tashjian have discussed, were a linguistically heterogeneous group speaking Turkish, speaking regional dialects, and more specifically, how Western Armenian, became the language and political tool that fashioned dispersion as diaspora. My research looks back at Western Armenian's presence in the print world to think about how the politically violent origins of dispersion and the luring specter of statehood affected the aesthetic development of literature and the ideological framing of a stateless language. More specifically, I look at Western Armenian at the intersection of trauma and transnationalism to suggest that whereas in the years following World War I, the Paris-based writers, and I focus on a group called Menk here, imagined the new Western Armenian literary world as consisting of a pluralistic transnational network of communities. The post-World War II writers gathered in the Middle East, and I focus here on the Writers Association of Syria and Lebanon, adopted a relatively homogeneous national model of literary production centralized in Beirut. Ultimately, these intersecting paradigms of belonging and identification, one to communities of dispersion, the other to diaspora communities, engendered opposing transnational and national imaginings of literature, which in turn created a clash between the language's natural development in relation to each host state's linguistic policies on one hand, and an insistence on orienting the language toward a homeland, whether mythically or territorially bound, on the other. In their language standardization efforts, intellectuals and writers in the Middle East positioned Western Armenian against, I'll move here, I should have shown a little bit of imagery just to help out this triangular relationship that I'm going to talk about. Writers in the Middle East positioned Western Armenian against Soviet Armenia, claiming that the Soviet Union's imperial aims threatened the Armenian national identity and language. As they developed a national rubric for a language and literature in exile, Western Armenian writers and educators thus believed themselves to be preserving the Armenian language's integrity against the Soviet Empire's colonizing force with the aim of an eventual return to the historic unified homeland. This national rubric, practiced as a form of diasporic transnationalism, became known as Hayetsi, which loosely translates to Armenian-oriented. The Hayetsi rubric measured the literariness of works through its evocation of the Armenian spirit, whether through a narrativization of the past, a lamentation of victimhood, or a celebration of resistance. Its restrictive demands on Western Armenian literature helped solidify the dispersed communities as a single unit known as the Armenian diaspora. I argue that its homogenizing drive, while creating a vital Armenian literacy apparatus in the Middle East, ultimately overpowered the pluralistic drive of statelessness and proved counterproductive to Western Armenian survival in the face of the diaspora's changing circumstances. Part of what fueled the emphasis on language and literature as a marker of national identity within this particular exercise of power in the diaspora, or what scholars have called the campaign of nation preservation in exile, was the growing rift between the two standards, owing to the progress the latter linguistic form was making in Soviet Armenia. As part of its program for cultural revolution, Soviet Armenia officially proclaimed Armenian its state language and began to build its cultural infrastructure, which consisted of establishing a national library, museum, theater, university, and so on. In 1921, it also, in a 1921 decree to eradicate illiteracy, it also introduced a number of orthographic reforms to the language. As Eastern Armenian benefited from state sponsorship and built a mechanism of production, publication, and circulation, anti-Soviet intellectuals in the diaspora began to question the motives of Soviet authorities and argued that language reforms were part of an orchestrated campaign to further separate Soviet Armenians from those Armenians in dispersion. The politicization of language debate reached a turning point immediately after World War II, when in the midst of the repatriation campaign, where a large group of Middle Eastern Armenians repatriated to Armenia, Middle Eastern Armenians intellectuals began to write explicitly against Soviet Armenia, criticizing its refusal to recognize the validity of Western Armenian as part of greater Armenian culture. In 1948, an article in Boston's Hayrenik Monthly referred to the Armenian community in the United States as the most unbust, which is disadvantageous community, arguing that in the absence of Armenian day schools in the States, there were no prospects for language maintenance there. Therefore, assessing the Middle East communities as more favorable spaces, political parties there worked toward constructing cultural and educational structures that sought to preserve the language. These newfound educational institutions made concerted effort to standardize and revivify the Western Armenian linguistic form. In addition to these standardization efforts in the day schools, a political campaign designed to prohibit the use of Turkish in colloquial speech within the refugee population and its expansion was adopted by community organizations. Ultimately, both endeavors forged a linguistically homogeneous group out of a culturally diverse population of survivors. I don't have the time to really go into the intricacies of this triangular debate, but in my research, I look at these two experiments, these literary experiments in their intersection and intervention to linguistic vitality in exile in a diasporic setting, and analyze both the journalistic writings of these authors as well as their fictional narratives. In the case of the Paris group, these fictional narratives are very much autobiographical and try to capture their experience of displacement, but they do not refer to the past. In fact, part of their literary platform is to launch a new literature that is disconnected from the Western Armenian tradition of the past. Whereas we see in Beirut, the writers gathered around Wassel doing quite the opposite, turning to poetry in the Hayati rubric that I described, and positioning themselves as the connecting thread to the literary movement prior to the genocide, the literary tradition prior to the break. And then they sort of, in the shadow or the lure of the specter of statehood that I'm talking about, try to standardize the Western Armenian language against sort of Soviet Armenia's shadow, and nationalize both literary production, cultural production, and linguistic production there. Today, Western Armenian literature, inherently diasporic, finds itself in a transitional moment, needing to confront the porous boundaries of its sites of production. Its speakers and writers now live not only in the Middle Eastern communities, but in Armenia and hybrid communities like Los Angeles, where I'm coming from. The shifting communities worldwide have generated texts about displacement that imagine a layering of locales in their attempt to either reconstruct or represent the perpetually exilic path of their Armenian characters. Furthermore, in their new proximity with Eastern Armenian, these contemporary texts push language toward new linguistic hybrid and innovative territories. In contrast to the Hayati model, where the Armenian language performs as the location of the work, these multi-directional explorations of location and localization of Armenian narratives invite us to imagine an alignment of form and content, that is to say, the language's expressive quality and its literary output's representational authority. As Western Armenian literary production awaits possible new iterations, a retrospective glance at its story of becoming seems more relevant than ever. By juxtaposing the Manx generation's attempt to create a transnational literary space with Wassel's efforts to nationalize literature in exile, my research presents a theory of language vitality for stateless languages that is inextricably tied to a literary orientation grounded in dispersion rather than diaspora, and one which could prove effective in the current dynamics of the shifting Armenian world, where lots of these revitalization efforts are happening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We have time for some questions. I know we're tight, but do you want to? Oh, I can do it too. All right. So I don't know if anybody, I know we have some folks on Zoom as well. Anybody have any questions? Yep. Let's go. Oh, hold on. Let me get you.
To Lori, I don't know if she can hear us.
Yes, I can hear. Yes.
Okay. People really, and I include myself in it. We don't know enough about the historical context of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Can you explore it a little bit? Just explain kind of the history, the politics, the economics, very briefly. What are the issues there? What's at stake? Beyond what's the impact is, but kind of what are the causes? So that's the question to you, Lori. To Lorena, I was very moved by this information that you shared with us. I wondered what's the role of art in recovering the experiences, precisely the trauma, the experiences that you spoke about. And I bring that question up because we had here at the Heard Museum a very moving artistic exhibit about how young, I'm not sure which particular tribe they were from, but how American Indian young artists try to address the very problems that you spoke from the linguistic perspective, but they did it more artistically. So that's the question to you. And the last question, I'm not totally clear about the difference between dispersion and diaspora. And where does exile come into your taxonomy, if it comes at all?
Shall we take those in turn? I can try and address a very big and complex question. This sort of depends how far back in time we want to go, which is not to say that this is a timeless conflict. There animosities and violence between these two communities does trace to the early 20th century, but really the conflict comes to a head in the post-Soviet period. Throughout the Soviet period of Soviet control in the region, the Armenian and Azerbaijani communities coexisted. There was a large Azerbaijani population in Armenia and a very large Armenian population in Azerbaijan. And the two communities were able, not always sort of harmoniously, but nevertheless able to coexist. What's at stake in the conflict is in part a construal of kind of sovereignty that is inextricably tied to the concept of sort of indigeneity. And therefore, competitions over primacy in the region are very much part of the discourse. And both groups actually can claim centuries of belonging in this region, although Armenians tend to, I would say, downplay the belongings of Azerbaijanis to this region as well, and other Islamic groups to this region as well. But what is at stake is claims to territory that are premised rather insistently on primacy of belonging and origins. So that's sort of one way to summarize it. But in a nutshell, the highland regions, the upland zones of Nagorno-Karabakh have been demographically majority Armenian for a very, very long time. And so Armenians understand Nagorno-Karabakh, or what they call Artsakh, the mountainous region, as indigenous territory. And certain parts of that region, especially the city of Shusha, or what Armenians call Shushi, Azerbaijanis understand as an extremely important cultural center for their own ethno-national development and cultural development. So yeah, I don't know. That's just sort of touching on some of the themes in the conflict. I'm happy to follow up with more specific questions.
Thank you.
Oh my God. Okay. I'm sorry, I keep hurting your ears. I'll just back up. So art is plays a really important role in this generation of talking about not only the history, but the way that it has impacted us. I had one art piece in my slides by an artist by the name of Kent Monkman, who's also Cree and comes from a community close to mine. His art is being shown all over the world. It doesn't just depict residential schools, but he does have residential school themed in some of his pieces. During the time when the residential school claims were being publicly recognized by media, there were a number of descendants of students from the former schools were starting to recognize, oh, I've been impacted by those schools, and they're starting to look at their families. But there was no opportunity during that time for that, for the trauma, the intergenerational trauma that a lot of descendants of the schools had been experiencing. So a lot of us did turn to art. I worked with a group of women. All of us had been parented by a mother who had attended the school, but all of us had, been deemed successful in our careers in some way. And so people are wondering what happened, right? And we didn't want to talk about our mother's experiences, but we wanted to talk about our experiences of being mothered by a parent who had attended the schools. And we used digital storytelling to be able to tell our stories. And when we put together our individual videos, digital stories are 3 to 5 minute videos attached to images or sound or music. When we put our videos together, we realized that we were telling one collective story that we could not just tell in each of those videos. There are a number of artists now in Canada that are using different art forms to talk about this history. Kent Monkman does very vivid paintings. Digital storytelling is one of them, and some people are writing poetry and short stories now. So I hope that answers some of your questions.
And thank you for that question about the distinction between dispersion and diaspora. So these are terms that I am theorizing based on language that the groups I'm looking at are using to describe the exiled communities. So on one hand, before World War II, before 1940s, if we use that as a marker, in the print press, in the Armenian language print press, so looking at Boston, Cairo, Aleppo, Beirut, Paris, the language with which the collectives of survivors are used, the language through which they're described is that of dispersion, servazuchun in Armenian, Turkish Armenian, community Armenian, immigrant Armenian, in these sort of pluralistic iterations. And in terms of sort of how the group that I'm looking at imagines the transnational space of literary production through Western Armenian is through an understanding of communities in exile. And this is where exile fits into it. As communities in exile, the concept of little Armenias is what they are propagating. Whereas diaspora comes into play, it comes to the foreground in the 40s, mid 40s and onward. Spürk, the word diaspora, and it's really cultivated as a political project to fashion nation in exile. So this is where exile fits into this, communities in exile versus nation in exile. And here, Western Armenian is, the language itself is used as a sort of as a way of homogenizing the very diverse communities globally into within this sort of national project.
So we have time for, that's the question. Oh, did you have, oh, okay, things like that. We have one more. No, let's say we have time for, we got 3 more and then.
I have a question for Lori. With the research that you do, I see you have presented in ICJ, but what other international forums do you present that? That's for you. And for Lorraine, recently we were involved in genocide teaching in high schools in Canada, in Ontario. And we had done some research about the people who speak their native language in Canada, I mean the Indigenous people. The number was given was about 96,000 people. And that Canada recognizes 7 genocides, and Indigenous genocide, or I mean cultural genocide, hyphenated. But the Indigenous genocide was not one of the genocide acknowledged or recognized by Canadian government. Am I wrong? I need that question to be answered. And also from linguistic perspective, I think that the northern province of Nunavut, the only province that they speak the native language is that province, right?
Nunavut,
Nunavut.
the Inuit.
That's the only place where they speak the native language. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The third question is, Talar, the Western Armenian, you said it's endangered language. With the incoming Eastern Armenians in places like Los Angeles and various, is there a new language being formed? What do you call that language? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. What I hope I tried to convey is that we're trying to figure out a kind of post-disciplinary form of research here. That's a term that I take from I.L. Weitzman of Forensic Architecture, a group that has really influenced the work that we're doing here. But how to think about research in a way that not only transcends disciplines, but enters into multiple fora beyond the university, within the university, but also beyond it in the public sphere more broadly. And we've been figuring out as we go along what this kind of post-disciplinary research can look like and what are the kinds of fora in which we can make our work visible in the hopes of it having not only a sort of not only bearing witness to destruction, but potentially, hopefully having at least some modicum of a deterrent effect. And that's the big question. Can this kind of work ever have a deterrent effect? So to that end, we disseminate our findings very broadly. Every few months, we release reports. Those reports go to the United States State Department, and we have some contacts at the UN that we always share our reports to. But what's often striking to me is how groups that we don't directly share our reports with because we don't have context, nevertheless come to know of it. So our findings have been cited in proceedings of the European Parliament, at the House of Lords in the UK as well. Some of our findings have been cited on the floor of committees at the House of Lords. In State Department reports concerning human rights and religious rights, especially pertaining to Azerbaijan, we're pleased to see that the work is engaged in those fora as well. I think that there is, I'm not a lawyer by training, I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist, but the more I engage with this work and consult with experts who are lawyers, the more I understand that there is more scope for legal action, including under the rubric of universal jurisdiction, beyond international courts like the ICJ, and even more remote, I would say, is the ICC for various regions. The last thing I'll say before I pass the floor, UNESCO has been conspicuously unengaged with what we're doing, and in general, not just with what we're doing. I think more generally, UNESCO has sort of withdrawn itself from the business of accountability with respect to cultural heritage destruction really ever since the Yugoslav wars, which was sort of the last time that UNESCO played a really active role in forensic work and in accountability work, specifically around the destruction of the historic city of Dubrovnik. But just more generally speaking, UNESCO has really receded and doesn't really play a role in accountability work around cultural heritage destruction in this region, and I would also say in other parts of the world as well. I hope that answers your question.
Can I turn this on? Can you hear me? Oh, it's on. Okay. So you had a couple of questions in terms of, you had mentioned that the data, the 96,000 speakers.
The language part of it, and then because we have a program in high school to teach about public genocide, and we have difficulty in getting the indigenous genocide to be part of our.
Oh, I see what you mean.
There is resistance to let the genocide, the indigenous genocide, be part of the program. We can discuss about Armenian genocide, Herero genocide, Holocaust, etc. When we come to indigenous genocide, we hit the wall. So that's one part of it. And the language, I feel that except one province, I don't see any like post-genocide, post-2015, that there's an effort to revitalize the language. Am I correct?
No, so there are about 96 Indigenous languages in Canada, and right now they predict that 3 will survive: Ojibwe, Cree, and Inuktitut. So Inuit, one of the Inuit languages that you mentioned, were the majority. Well, I wouldn't say the majority, but a number of people still can speak the language. All Indigenous languages in Canada are endangered. They vary from no speakers to, I think in Nunavut, there's 20,000 Inuit speakers. The transmission of these languages are not occurring for a number of reasons. One is that people are afraid still to pass on the language. We don't have access to these languages in the schools. Up in Nunavut, where the majority of people speak an Indigenous language, children are forced to go into French immersion or English because that's the dominant language in Canada, and that's the schooling that children have to go through. And yet you're in communities where the only language that they speak is Inuktitut. So children are being forced to learn English and French. So up until grade 3, they're able to to learn their language in school. And then after that, they're forced to go into English or French. And what we're finding is that a lot of those children will drop out of school because they don't do well in either language. They're not able to get employment after that. And there's high suicide rates in that community. A lot of people are dying in Nunavut because health services, doctors, nurses that come into the community can't communicate with them. So they're being misdiagnosed. When you come further in the southern part of Canada, the languages are fewer, like we have fewer speakers, and they're not being taught in the schools. We have an aging population. The majority of speakers are over the age of 70 now, and they're not being transmitted. So education plays a critical role in revitalizing our languages right now because it's not being taught at home. In terms of genocide in Canada, the Canadian government has acknowledged that what happened in the schools is genocide. It's been in the news, it's been publicly announced. We have 2 reports that the government has adopted. One was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that does identify what happened in the schools as cultural genocide. We also have a report on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that was released in 2020, I believe. Anyways, just recently, which identifies that there's ongoing genocide in Canada because of the disappearance of Indigenous women and girls, and the Canadian government has adopted that proposal. So the government has acknowledged that what has occurred in the schools is genocide, but that genocide is ongoing because of what's happening to Indigenous women and girls. So I think in terms of education, it's maybe getting the contents of those reports. And there are a lot of schools in Canada that are using the contents of those reports to discuss this history in terms of genocide. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in the area of education around the boarding school and residential school history to be able to talk about it and to provide educational materials that identify that history as not only a genocide, but is ongoing in our communities. So
So Los Angeles presents an interesting case of a second diaspora. We have there sort of the Armenian speaking population there is comprised of those who have come or migrated there from Middle Eastern communities, Western Armenian speaking population, layered with Eastern Armenian speakers, immigrants from Iran, now in multiple generations, and immigrants from Soviet Armenia, post-Soviet Armenia, the Republic. And so this certainly creates an incredibly rich contact zone for the East and West, as well as the various dialects that they bring together in a predominantly English-speaking sort of hub. So we do see cases in the spoken vernacular of hybridity, but in terms of where this is a very short-lived moment, I believe, because if we think about just the sheer size of Eastern speakers, which overwhelms Western speakers, what we will see in time is this hybridity dying out and Western Armenian assimilating into Eastern Armenian. In terms of the sort of the literary standards, we still have a day school system, a few day school systems that do teach Western Armenian, but most of these schools are now introducing the two tracks to serve the community of Eastern and Western. And we have immersion programs in local public schools that teach, of course, the Eastern Armenian because the material sources come from Armenia. So there is the state apparatus that also weighs in on this sort of the politics of language on the ground, where Western is really left to revitalization efforts by various projects and side organizations. And since the 20 to 10 sort of designation that spurred a lot of alarm in the community, there are some really wonderful projects of revitalization taking place in Western Armenian, I should say.
Professor Khatchadourian, that photo of you speaking at the UN is awesome. Could you tell us in a few words what it's like to speak at the UN?
A wild experience in the life of an archaeologist most of whose career was spent, working on the Iron Age 2,500 years ago and very esoteric work. I will say that the most unexpected and intimidating aspect of that is that Azerbaijan had a delegation in the room, and they were seated immediately to my right, as Henry can attest. And I wasn't expecting that. And it was the first time that I had sort of direct encounter with the state that I'm accusing of erasure and cultural genocide or cultural erasure. And that was discomforting, to say the least. And I did my best to actually direct my speech to the agents of the state that were there. And so that was kind of intense and unexpected. Otherwise, it was a rewarding experience. And I want to say particularly because it was a comparative panel yet again, and it was organized by the Armenian mission to the United Nations, And I appreciate the effort of the Armenian Mission to organize an event on the prevention of atrocity crimes in the digital age that wasn't focused exclusively around Nagorno-Karabakh or the Armenian experience, but understood these as global problems that need attention, and that Armenian communities have a particular investment in and vantage point from which to think about.
Great. And our last question goes to one of our conference organizers.
My question's for Lorena. As you said, it's ongoing in Canada, right? Because settler colonial genocides, that if you don't change the colonizer structures, it's going to be ongoing, manifest in lots of different ways, pipelines. And even with the TRC, I read recently, because I've been down in the US now for about 11 years, and I try to follow these things. I saw that the Canadian government's implemented zero still, and the Indigenous-led think tank that reports on it stopped, because at this point, it's 2078 that they're on par for implementing these things, because there has been truth, like there has been progress, because the horrible things I learned in school, like empty land narratives and all that, like my 11-year-old niece, she does the Orange Shirt Day, she has elders who come to her school, she knows she lives on stolen land, and as an 11-year-old, she is more informed than a lot of adults are. We do the land acknowledgements, but we don't get back land. Are you hopeful that we can make the next step from, some of the performative stuff to actually, actually decolonize, change our structures? Because it's not going to stop as long as we continue to maintain our colonial structures. Do you have any hope for Canada moving in that direction, like further than we have?
Well, I think there has been a lot of change. I think the TRC prompted the education system to teach about this history, and some provinces are doing a better job than others. The fact that your niece is participating in events to mark this history, I think is really important, because that's where we're going to see the change, right? Is in the younger generation, in being able to understand this history and the implications that it has on Indigenous peoples today. In Manitoba, we have a new premier who's Indigenous. He's an Ojibwe person, the first one in Canada. So there are movements for Indigenous people to make change within the current colonial system, in addition to the advocacy work that's being done outside. Those are I think those are days where I'm feeling really positive. There are days where I feel that we haven't moved very far. We still are uncovering graves of children, unmarked graves in Canada, and that history hasn't been told. The TRC sort of left that the unmarked grave issue is something that we have to carry on into the work that goes beyond the TRC. They identified about 80 unmarked graves in Canada, and we still don't know what happened to those children. There's still a lot of work to be done in uncovering the history, but also the stories of the children that went to those schools. So on a good day, I feel that there is movement, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So.
Yeah, and then in my home province where I grew up, Alberta, they dialed it back. They had a government that came up with a different curriculum that tried to not just tell a colonial history. Then the new government in Alberta just totally erased that, and like all the progress that was made in curriculum and pedagogy, it just took a change in government for all that to be wiped out. So
Right.
I'm glad things are going better in Manitoba.
Yeah, no, I think the work that this conference does because the denial of this history, even though that we've got a report now in Canada that documents it and has identified it as genocide, we still have scholars in Canada that are writing that this history didn't happen, that we've embellished it. So these types of educational forums, I think, are really critical.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists first and foremost. One more round of applause. And thanks to a great studio audience sticking it out. I gotta say, it's a testament to the discussion that we have been a part of, that it's gone more than a half hour over time, and we probably could stay another hour with more questions, it sounds like. So thank you again. Thank you to the great audience. And am I turning it over to you, or is there anything formal? Okay.
Yes, this was the last panel. Doesn't mean it's the last thing of the day. In L120, downstairs, 6:30, Ludo Hood of the State Department will be speaking. So if you're online, tune in. If you're in this room, you want to go join us downstairs at 6:30, please do. So, and we'll conclude the conference, and that'll be the final thing here on the ASU Tempe campus, although it's not totally over because there are things going on at Scottsdale Community College on Friday and Saturday. So I'd be remiss if I did not mention them. Thank you. Oh, we've got Greg Sarkeesian who wants to make a comment.
I'm the president of Zorian Institute. I want to thank you, ASU, for this opportunity for us to bring our contribution here, and with this fantastic panelists. And I thank you on behalf of the Institute, our board, our staff, and we promise to give more. As you want to have more of us, we bring more of us. Thank you.
And yes, we do want more of you. So thank you for that offer. We'll take you up on it. All right.